Alright, this is for 5th grade ELA text set 6. Text set is freedom. The central question is, what is freedom? How does the desire for freedom drive people to action? The goal is to identify the author's purpose in writing the composition. So imagine living in a place where an army officer can come into your classroom and tell you what to do. That's what happens to a boy named Pedro in this book, a realistic fiction story called The Composition by Antonio Scamarta, illustrated by Alfonso Ruona. Pedro lives in a country that has been taken over by a military dictatorship. What do you know about that kind of government? Let's find out what it's like for Pedro. Pedro was disappointed. His parents had given him a soccer ball for his birthday, but he had wanted a white leather ball with black patches, like the one real soccer players use, not this plastic thing with blue spots. When I want to make a header, this ball just floats away. It feels like a bird. It's so light, he protested. So much the better, answered his father. This way you can't hurt your head and get dizzy. He gestured to Pedro to be quiet because he wanted to hear the radio. For the past month, the streets had been filled with soldiers. Now Pedro noticed that every night his father would settle into his favorite spot on the sofa. Then he and Pedro's mother would adjust the antenna on the radio and listen carefully. Sometimes friends joined them. They sat on the floor, smoking like chimneys, with their heads pressed to the green box. Why are you always listening to this noisy radio? Pedro asked his mother. Because it's interesting, she answered. What does it say? Things about us, about our country. What things? Pedro asked again. Things that are happening. How come it's so hard to hear? He demanded. The voices are a long way away, his mother answered. Pedro looked sleepily out the window, trying to guess from which of the faraway hills the voices could be coming. In October, Pedro became the star of the neighborhood soccer games. Sometimes he played with his friends along a deliciously shaded street. It was as cool as swimming in a river in summer. Pedro felt as though he were in a stadium roofed with murmuring leaves that applauded as he took a pass from his friend Daniel, whose father, Don Daniel, owned the local grocery store. Like the great star Pele, Pedro snuck through the giant defenseman and shot straight through the post for a goal. I scored, yelled Pedro, and he ran to hug his teammates. They lifted him onto their shoulders because even though they had just turned 9, he was small and light. Why are you so little? They teased him. Because my father is small and my mother is small, Pedro said. Probably your grandfather and grandmother are too, because you are so tiny and little, but I am smart and fast. The only thing that's fast about you guys is your mouth, Pedro retorted. So the author is showing us who Pedro is. How would you describe him as a character? One day when the boys were playing on the street, Pedro rushed on a goal. He ran up to Daniel, who was the goaltender. Pedro faked a shot, and when Daniel leaned forward to intercept the ball, Pedro gently kicked it over him through the two pebbles that served as goal spots. Goal! Screamed Pedro. He waited for his friends' applause, but no one was paying any attention. Everyone was staring at Don Daniel's grocery store. Up and down the street, windows were opening. People were craning around the corner to see. Some doors slammed shut. Then Pedro saw what everyone else was looking at. Daniel's father was being dragged down the street by 2 men. A group of soldiers were pointing machine guns at him. When Daniel tried to approach his father, a soldier pushed him back. Calm down, said the soldier. Don Daniel looked at his son. Take care of the story for me, he said. As the soldier pushed him toward a jeep, Don Daniel tried to put his hand in his pocket. Immediately, a soldier raised his machine gun. Careful, he shouted. I want to give my son the keys to the store, Don Daniel said. A soldier grabbed his arm. I'll do it, he barked. The soldier felt Don Daniel's pocket. When he heard a jingle, he pulled out the keys and threw them. Daniel caught them. The jeep pulled away, and the mothers who had been standing in their doorways ran out, grabbed their children by their collars, and pushed them into their houses. Pedro stood by Daniel in the swirling dust that the jeep had stirred up at it, drove off. Why did they take him? Pedro asked. Daniel pushed his hands into his pockets and squeezed the keys. My father is against the dictatorship, he said. Pedro had heard these words before on the radio at night, but he didn't really understand them. What does that mean? He asked. Daniel looked at the empty street and whispered, They want the country to be free, for the army not to be the government. They arrest people for that, asked Pedro. I think so, answered Daniel. What are you going to do? Asked Pedro. I don't know, said Daniel. A neighbor came up and ran his hand through Daniel's hair. "I'll help you close up," he said. So Daniel says people against the dictatorship want the country to be free, for the army not to be the government. What does it mean for a country to be governed by an army? What's right or wrong with that? Pedro walked off, dribbling his ball. Since there was no one around to play with, he ran across the street to wait for the bus that would bring his father home from work. When his father arrived, Pedro hugged him. His father leaned down and gave him a kiss. "Isn't your mother back yet?" he asked. "No," answered Pedro. "Did you play much?" "A little," said Pedro. His father held Pedro's head tight against his chest. "Soldiers came and took Daniel's father away," said Pedro. "I know," said his father. "How do you know?" asked Pedro. "They called me on the phone and told me." "Daniel owns the store now," said Pedro. "Maybe he'll give me some candy." "I don't think so," said the father. "They took Don Daniel away in a jeep just like the ones in the movies," said Pedro. His father didn't say anything. He breathed deeply and looked sadly down the street. Even though it was still light, the only people were men coming slowly home from work. "Do you think it will be on TV?" asked Pedro. "What?" asked his father. "Don Daniel." "No." That night, Pedro sat down to eat with his mother and father. Even though no one told him to be quiet, Pedro didn't say a word. His parents ate without speaking either. Suddenly, his mother started to cry silently. "Why is my mother crying?" asked Pedro. His father looked first at Pedro and then at Pedro's mother, but he said nothing. "I'm not crying," his mother said. "Did someone do something to you?" asked Pedro. "No," she answered. They finished their supper in silence, and Pedro went to put on his PJs. When he came back to the living room, he saw that his parents were hugging each other on the sofa. Their heads were bent close to the radio, which was making strange sounds. It was hard to hear what they were because the volume was turned down very low. "Father, are you against the dictatorship?" Pedro asked quickly. His father looked at his son, then at his wife, and then they both looked at Pedro. His father nodded slowly. "Will they take you to jail too?" Pedro asked. "No," said his father. "How do you know?" Pedro said. "Because you bring me luck," smiled his father. Pedro leaned against the doorframe, pleased that he wasn't being sent off to bed as usual. He paid attention to the radio, trying to understand it when the radio said the military dictatorship. Pedro felt as if all the pieces that had been floating around loose on his head were coming together like a jigsaw puzzle. "Father," he said, "am I against the dictatorship?" His father looked at Pedro's mother as though the answer to the question might be written in her eyes. His mother scratched his cheek with a funny look and said, "I can't say." "Why not?" asked Pedro. "Children aren't against anything," she said. "Children are just children. They have to go to school, study hard, play, and be good to their parents." Usually when Pedro heard long sentences like that, he stayed quiet. But this time, when his eyes still firmly fixed on the radio, he said, "Okay, but if Daniel's father is in jail, Daniel won't be able to go to school." "Go to bed, son," said his father. So Pedro's parents seemed reluctant to answer his questions. "Why do you think that is?" The next day, Pedro ate 2 pieces of toast with jam, washed his face, and ran to school as fast as he could so he wouldn't be late. On the way, he saw a blue kite caught in a tree, but no matter how high he jumped, he couldn't reach it. The bell was still ringing when the teacher walked into the classroom. She was walking stiffly. A man wearing a military uniform strode beside her. He had a metal pin to his chest, a gray mustache, and dark glasses, darker than the dirt on Pedro's knee after a soccer game. "Stand up very straight, children," the teacher said. The children stood up. The soldier smiled until under his toothbrush-shaped mustache and his dark glasses. "Good morning, my young friends," he said. "I am Captain Romo, and I am here on behalf of the government, that is to say, General Perdomo, to invite the children in the school to write a composition. The child who writes the very best one will receive a gold medal and a sash in the colors of the flag from General Perdomo's very own hand. The winner will also carry the flag in the Patriots' Week parade." Captain Ramon put his hands behind his back, gave a little jump, and straightened his neck, lifting his chin a little. "Attention, sit down." So what do you think of this officer and how the students respond to his directions? What do you think that will think is behind this assignment? The children obeyed. "All right," said the captain. "Take out your notebooks. Notebooks at the ready. Take out your pencils. Pencils at the ready. Write. Title of the composition. What my family does at night. Understand? This is to say what you and your parents do from the moment you get home from school and work. Which friends come over, what they talk about, what they say, about the television programs you watch, anything you can think of. Just write it down. You're free to write what you think like. Now, 1, 2, 3, start." "Can I erase?" I asked the boy. "Yes," said the captain. Can I write with a ballpoint pen? Asked another. Yes, boy, of course. Can I use a sheet with little squares? Asked a girl. Perfect, answered the captain. Sir, how much do we have to write? Asked another boy. 2 or 3 pages. 2 or 3 pages, groaned the children. Very well, replied the captain. 1 or 2, then. Now write, he bellowed. The children sucked on their pencils and looked up at the ceiling to see if some ideas might come flying down into their heads. Pedro was chewing on his pencil, but he couldn't think of even one word. He picked his nose. A tiny snot came out by mistake, and he put it under his desk. At the next desk, Juan was biting his nails one by one. Do you eat them? Asked Pedro. What? Said Juan. Your nails. No, I cut them with my teeth, and then I spit them out like this, see? The captain walked down the aisle, and Pedro could see his hard, shiny gold belt buckle. You two, aren't you working? He said, yes, sir, said Juan, and he wrinkled his eyebrows, stuck his tongue between his teeth, and wrote a big A to start his composition. When the captain walked back toward the blackboard to talk to the teacher, Pedro looked over at Juan's sheet. What are you going to write? He asked. Anything, said Juan. How about you? I don't know, said Pedro. What do you do? What did your parents do yesterday? Asked Juan. Same as usual. They come home, they ate, they listened to the radio, they went to bed. Just like my mother. My mother started crying, said Pedro. Mothers are always crying, said Juan. I hardly ever cry, said Pedro. I haven't cried for a year. What about if I hit you and you get a black eye? Would you cry then? Said Juan. Why would you do that when you're my friend? Said Pedro. That's true, I wouldn't, answered Juan. The boys put their pencils in their mouths again and looked at the burnt light bulb in the shadows on the wall. Pedro felt as if his head was as empty as a piggy bank with no money in it. He leaned over to Juan and whispered in his ears, Are you against the dictatorship? Juan looked up to see where the captain was and leaned toward Pedro. Of course, stupid. Pedro moved away and winked, smiling, then pretended to write. He said, But you're a child. So what? Answered Juan. My mother said that children, began Pedro. They all say that, said Juan. They took my father away up north. Just like Daniel, said Pedro. Yeah, just like Daniel. Pedro looked down at what he had written on this paper. What My Family Does at Night by Pedro Melbourne. Sierra School, grade 3A. Juan, if I win the medal, I'm going to sell it to buy a size 5 soccer ball made of leather with black patches, he said. Then he wet his pencil lead with a bit of spit, took a deep breath, and wrote, When my father comes home from work. A week went by. A tree in the square fell down because it was so old. The garbage truck didn't come for 5 days, and flies buzzed around people's eyes. Gustavo Martinez, who lived across the street, got married, and neighbors shared his wedding cake. The Jeep came back and took Manuel Perdraz, the teacher, to jail. The priest didn't want to say Sunday Mass. So what do you think Pedro is going to write? I'm going to skip this part so I can get to it. Pedro ate his candy on the way home. During supper the night, he said to his father, what about? Asked his father as he ate his soup what our family does at night. Father's spoon fell on his plate and splashed some soup onto the tablecloth. He looked at Pedro's mother. And what did you write, son? She asked. He went through his notebooks. Do you want me to read it to you? The captain congratulated me. Bravo, I congratulate you. The captain. What captain? The one who made us write the composition. Sierra School, grade 3A. Just read what it says, okay? His father interrupted. Says, when my father comes home from work, I wait for him at the bus stop. When sometimes my mother is at home, and when my father comes in, she says, What's up, kid? What happened today? Fine, says my father, and how about you? Then I go out and play soccer. I like scoring headers. Then comes my mother and says, Pedro, come and eat, and we sit at the table, and I eat everything except soup because I don't like it. After supper every night, my father and mother sit on the sofa and play chess, and I do my homework, and they go on playing chess until it's time to go to bed. And that I don't know because I'm asleep. Sighed, Pedro Melbourne. No, if you give me the prize for this competition, I hope it's a soccer ball, but not a plastic one. Pedro looked up and saw that his parents were smiling. Well, said his father, we'd better buy a chess set. Okay, so were you surprised? What do you think about Pedro now?